It was a quiet Christmas Eve, one that was supposed to be filled with laughter and warmth. Nia had always loved the holiday season, but after a tough year, one filled with personal losses and a few shattered friendships, she found herself alone in her apartment. At 32, she had grown accustomed to solitude. Being an independent woman in a busy city, she worked as an event planner for a prestigious company, organizing high-end parties for clients who wanted nothing but perfection. Her work kept her occupied, and her evenings were usually filled with hours of planning, emails, and phone calls. But tonight, things were different. She had decided, somewhat out of necessity, to host a small Christmas Eve dinner. She didn't expect much, just a colleague from work who had recently moved to town and who she thought might enjoy a night away from his own lonely apartment. His name was Mark. He had been polite and friendly in the office, never quite warm but never cold either. They had exchanged pleasantries, and when she casually invited him over, she thought it would be a good way to fill the quiet night. Nia's apartment was cozy, adorned with twinkling lights, a small tree in the corner, and the aroma of cinnamon and pine filling the air. She prepared a simple meal, setting the table for two, trying to make it feel festive despite the somber mood that lingered in her heart. The apartment was a far cry from the grand halls she usually worked in, but it was hers, her sanctuary. She found herself staring at the clock, each minute dragging on longer than the last. Mark hadn't responded to her messages confirming his arrival time, but she wasn't too worried. He seemed like a bit of a loner, and perhaps his own holiday plans had changed. Still, she couldn't shake the odd feeling that had settled in her stomach, as if something wasn't quite right. She was accustomed to being a planner, to taking control of situations, and yet she felt unsettled, her mind racing with scenarios she couldn't quite explain. Around 6:30 p.m., she decided to check in again. Mark had confirmed he was coming, but his message was terse, just a simple, "I'll be there soon." Nia tried to dismiss the worry, focusing instead on the evening ahead. She put on some music, a soft mix of classic Christmas songs that she hoped would help create the right atmosphere. But the silence in her apartment felt suffocating, and her thoughts began to drift. It wasn't that she hated being alone, but after the year she'd had, the quiet was almost too much to bear. As the hours passed, she kept herself busy, checking the door multiple times, adjusting the table, ensuring everything was just right. But deep down, she knew something was off. It wasn't about Mark. It wasn't even about the loneliness. It was a gut feeling, a sense that she couldn't shake, a feeling that something was about to change. Finally, just as she was starting to lose hope, the doorbell rang. Nia opened the door with a polite smile, but it faded the moment she saw Mark standing there. The man who had always seemed so composed in the office now looked different. His clothes were slightly wrinkled, as if he'd hurried to get here. His face was drawn, eyes slightly bloodshot, but he offered her a tight smile nonetheless. "Hey, Nia. Sorry, I'm late," Mark said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. His voice was lower than usual, almost too soft. Nia couldn't put her finger on it, but something in his demeanor set her on edge. "It's all right, come on in," Nia said, trying to sound as welcoming as possible. She stepped aside, allowing him to enter, and immediately noticed the scent that clung to him, a mixture of cheap cologne and something faintly unpleasant, like sweat. He took off his coat and hung it on the coat rack without saying another word. Nia briefly glanced at the clock. It was almost 8 p.m. Now, she felt the strange unease growing. Mark had never been the type to arrive late without a reason, but she brushed it off, deciding to focus on the evening. It wasn't that big of a deal, right? Nia led him to the dining table, where the dinner she'd carefully prepared sat waiting. The soft candlelight flickered across the room, casting shadows that made the apartment feel smaller than it was. They sat across from each other, Nia doing most of the talking, trying to cover the awkwardness that now filled the air. Mark didn't seem particularly interested in the meal or the conversation, his eyes wandering around the room as if distracted by something he couldn't name. Nia could feel the tension thickening between them, a palpable unease that lingered in the space. Every time she looked at him, there was something just a bit off, something unsettling in the way he watched her, his gaze always lingering just a second too long. So, Nia began, attempting to steer the conversation back to something light. "How have things been at work? I know it's been a crazy season for all of us." Mark's lips twitched, but his expression remained distant. "Yeah, busy. You know how it is." His words were flat, lacking the enthusiasm she expected from someone who spent their days planning events, trying to impress clients. Mark was good at his job, she had to give him that. But this wasn't the same Mark she'd known. The shift in his behavior was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to make her feel like something was wrong. Nia cleared her throat, trying to shake off the feeling that was slowly creeping up on her. She forced herself to smile, setting the wine bottle between them. "How about we have some wine? It might help with the mood." Mark didn't respond immediately. He just stared at the bottle for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as though he were trying to make a decision. Finally, he nodded and gave a half-smile, his lips curling slightly. "Yeah, sure." Nia poured them both a glass, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy despite the odd, growing tension. She clinked her glass against his, trying to make the best of a situation that was starting to feel off-kilter. "So, what do you usually do for Christmas?" she asked, hoping to find some common ground. She didn't expect an answer like this. "I don't really do much," Mark said softly. "I usually just keep to myself." Nia's eyebrows furrowed. "Oh, really? I thought maybe you had family or something." Mark's eyes flicked to hers, then quickly away. "No family. Just me." The words lingered in the air, heavy with something Nia couldn't quite identify. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but she quickly shook it off. There was no need to make things more awkward. "Okay," she said, trying to sound casual. "Well, I'm glad you could make it tonight. It's nice to have someone to share the holiday with." Mark didn't respond, but he gave her a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. They ate their meal in silence, the atmosphere now thicker with discomfort. Nia tried to break the silence a few more times, but Mark's responses were brief, distant. The conversation felt strained, and she couldn't help but notice that his eyes kept flicking around the apartment, lingering on the front door, the windows, the hallway. It was as though he was looking for something, or someone. The unease that had settled in Nia's stomach only grew as the evening wore on. She began to wonder if inviting Mark had been a mistake. Maybe he wasn't who she thought he was. As the evening dragged on, the atmosphere in the apartment became thick with an unspoken tension that Nia couldn't ignore. Every time Mark shifted in his seat or moved to refill his glass, Nia could feel his presence in a way that made her uncomfortable. It wasn't physical, but something deeper, a feeling that perhaps this was more than just a holiday dinner between colleagues. The clock ticked away, the soft hum of the apartment's heating system the only noise between them. Nia took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, but every time she looked up, Mark was staring at her. It wasn't a casual glance, it was deliberate. Unblinking. The weight of his gaze felt suffocating, and it made the space feel smaller, as if the walls were closing in on her. "Would you like some more wine?" Nia asked, trying to break the silence. Mark didn't answer immediately. He just blinked slowly, then nodded. Nia stood, but before she could make it to the counter, she heard him speak again. "You know," he said, his voice lower than usual, "I don't really do Christmas. Haven't in a long time." Nia turned to face him, trying to read the tone of his words. "What do you mean?" "Christmas is a time for family, for people to come together. It doesn't have to be sad." Mark's eyes narrowed, and there was something in his expression now that sent a chill down Nia's spine. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "Sometimes, it's better to be alone," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Nia swallowed, her mouth suddenly dry. She forced a smile, trying to keep the conversation light. Well, I'm glad you came tonight. It's nice to have someone to share the holiday with. But even as she said the words, she felt the sincerity in her voice fading, replaced by an uneasy tension. She poured the wine, her hands shaking slightly as she handed him the glass. Mark took it without a word, his fingers brushing hers just long enough to make her feel uncomfortable, as if he was lingering just a little too long. As the evening wore on, Mark's behavior only grew more unsettling. He didn't seem interested in the food anymore, barely touching his plate. His eyes kept flicking toward the front door, the windows, anywhere but at her. Nia couldn't ignore the rising sense of anxiety building in her chest. This wasn't how she had imagined the evening going. It wasn't even close. She excused herself to the bathroom, needing a moment alone to regain her composure. She washed her hands, staring at her reflection in the mirror. What was going on with Mark? Why did he seem so different tonight? Nia rubbed her temples, trying to ease the tension in her mind. She needed to get her bearings, to feel like herself again. When she returned to the dining room, the first thing she noticed was how quiet it was. The absence of sound, of conversation, it was deafening. She stepped into the room cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the carpet. And that's when she saw it. Mark was standing by the window, his back to her. The curtains were slightly drawn, but his silhouette was unmistakable. The way he stood there, rigid and tense, was unlike anything she had seen before. It was as if he were waiting for something, scanning the street below as if expecting someone. Mark? Nia called out, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to sound confident. What are you doing? He turned slowly, his face expressionless, but his eyes were wide, wild even. I thought I saw someone out there, he stammered, his words coming out too fast. Someone watching. Nia's stomach dropped. She tried to laugh it off, but it felt hollow. There's no one out there. It's just us. Maybe you've had too much to drink. But Mark didn't respond. Instead, he stepped back from the window, his eyes never leaving hers. There was something in his gaze now, a coldness that hadn't been there before. Nia's heart began to race. Mark, are you okay? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he took a few steps toward her, his movements deliberate and slow. The hair on the back of Nia's neck stood on end. Something was terribly wrong, and she knew it. The man she thought she knew was slipping away, replaced by someone she didn't recognize. Mark, I think it's time for you to go, she said firmly, her voice trembling but filled with resolve. I'm not feeling well. It's getting late. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then Mark's lips curled into a tight, unsettling smile. You don't want me to go, he said softly, almost soothingly. You invited me, remember? Nia took a step back, her breath coming faster now. Mark, please. You need to leave. But Mark didn't move. Instead, he closed the distance between them in one swift motion, his hand reaching out and gripping her wrist tightly. Nia gasped, trying to pull away, but his grip was unyielding. His fingers dug into her skin, and the panic started to flood her chest. You can't make me leave, Mark whispered, his breath warm against her face. Not until I'm done. Nia struggled to free herself, her mind racing. She had to get away. She had to escape. Nia's pulse pounded in her ears as she yanked her wrist free, her heart racing. Mark's hand released her almost reluctantly, but the chilling look in his eyes remained. She stepped back quickly, eyes darting to the door, but Mark was already blocking her way. His tall frame loomed in front of her, too close, too menacing. The air between them felt thick with something dark, something dangerous that she had missed earlier in the evening. You need to leave now, Nia said, her voice gaining strength despite the fear threatening to overwhelm her. She kept her distance, trying to remain calm, but every instinct in her body was screaming to run. Mark didn't respond immediately. He simply stood there, a twisted smile playing at the corners of his lips. "You don't understand," he said softly, his voice low and almost hypnotic. "I'm not going anywhere. I don't want to be alone tonight." His words hung in the air, dripping with something that made Nia's skin crawl. She could feel her legs shaking beneath her, but she forced herself to remain composed, to not let him see how terrified she truly was. "This isn't how you handle things," she said, trying to appeal to whatever sanity might still be left in him. "You don't just show up uninvited and make someone uncomfortable." Mark's expression shifted then. His smile disappeared, replaced by something darker. His jaw clenched as he took a step forward, and Nia instinctively took one back. The distance between them was shrinking, and she knew she had to act fast. "You're so quick to judge, but you don't even know me," he said, his voice a low growl. "You think I'm the one who's wrong. You don't know what it's like to be ignored. To be invisible. I'm tired of being invisible." Nia's mind raced. This wasn't just a bad date, or even an uncomfortable situation anymore. Mark wasn't just acting strange, he was dangerous. She could feel the darkness in his words, the simmering rage bubbling just below the surface. He wasn't just a man who'd had too much to drink. He was a man on the edge, and she was standing too close to the precipice. She needed to get out. But the door was behind him, and she had no way of getting around him without triggering his violent tendencies. Nia's thoughts raced as she tried to think of a way to de-escalate the situation. "Mark, please. You're upset, I can tell. But this isn't you," she said, trying to keep her tone steady, but it cracked under the strain. "You need help. You can't stay here. You should call someone. Go home." Mark's expression flickered for a moment, as if her words had registered, but then it was gone, replaced by an eerie calmness. He reached into his jacket pocket, and for a moment, Nia froze. Her mind raced, wondering if he had a weapon, something to threaten her with. But when he pulled his hand back, it was empty. He only held a phone. "I'm not leaving," he repeated, his voice quieter now. "I've been here too long. I won't be ignored again." Her heart stopped for a split second as she realized what he was doing. He was texting someone. Who? Who was he reaching out to? And what did he intend to do after that? The unease in her gut grew stronger. She had no idea who this man really was, but she had no choice but to act quickly. She glanced around the room, looking for anything she could use to defend herself. The kitchen was close, sharp objects, heavy things. She could make a break for it. But her eyes kept returning to Mark's face, the coldness in his gaze locking her in place. She had to keep talking. Keep him distracted. Suddenly, he turned away from her, breaking their eye contact for the first time in what felt like forever. He went to the window again, looking out into the street. Nia's heart raced as she heard him muttering to himself.